November 22nd, 1963, Dallas, Texas. An event that changed United States history forever. A shocked nation would mourn their fallen president. This story has been told, retold, with varying theories of what really happened. One thing we know for sure: there would be a massive state funeral for President John F. Kennedy. And that's the story we are going to tell today. What happened? How did it happen? And when did it happen? Let's go back to 1963, detail the happenings, and find out just how massive this funeral would be. The funeral of President John F. Kennedy. President Kennedy's widow, Jacqueline, began making plans for the event, carefully crafting a day of solemn remembrance mixed with elegance and splendor, befitting of a beloved president. The body of President Kennedy was brought back to Washington, D.C. quickly after his death. The casket would be placed in the East Room of the White House for 24 hours after the return of the president. We will be looking at photos from throughout those few days and remember the president. The casket, flag draped, would be placed on a horse-drawn carriage and taken to the Capitol to lie in state. Throughout the day and night, thousands upon thousands of people would file past the casket to pay their respects. Seemingly, people came from everywhere. Over 90 countries would send representatives from their respective nations to attend the state funeral of President Kennedy, which would take place on Monday, November 25th. President Kennedy had no funeral plans in place, so it would take some quick decisions and action to bring such an ornate and massive event to the masses. The state funeral would see military authorities take the lead. Army Major General Philip Well and retired Army Colonel Paul C. Miller would head to the White House to begin working with President Kennedy's brother-in-law, Sergeant Shriver, to begin the coordination of the event. It was here that they decided that the body would lie in the East Room of the White House for 24 hours and then make its way by carriage to the Capitol, as previously mentioned, to lie in state all day on Sunday. After the autopsy of Kennedy, his body was prepared by embalmers for burial. This was performed at Bethesda Naval Hospital. Kennedy's body was placed in a mahogany casket. The original bronze casket used was damaged on the trip back from Dallas, so a new one was selected. The original casket was disposed of by the Air Force, and it was disposed of in the Atlantic Ocean. It can be easy to see by historians and those who have studied this the parallels with Lincoln's funeral. And when pallbearers carried the casket to the East Room, he was placed there, just like Lincoln had been 100 years earlier. Mrs. Kennedy at this time was still wearing the blood-stained dress that she was wearing in Dallas, and only after the body was properly placed in the East Room with black crepe did she leave to go to her private room. After 24 hours in the East Room, nearly 300,000 people stood solemnly and watched a horse-drawn carriage slowly carry the body from the White House to the United States Capitol. The casket was flag-covered. Soldiers carrying the colors from all 50 states were standing there as the casket went by. The public was silent and reverent as the riderless horse passed by. The First Lady would make her way into the rotunda with their children and knelt beside of the casket. Brief eulogies were given inside of the rotunda. Thousands of people filed past the casket and withstood freezing temperatures over the span of 18 hours to pay their respects. Around 250,000 people would file past the casket, and it was said that the wait to walk past the casket was 10 hours long. The original plans was to close the Capitol at 9 p.m., but massive crowds led to the decision to keep it open. Around 9 p.m. that night, the First Lady would arrive again, along with the President's brother, Robert. Behind the scenes, authorities with the military would begin coordinating with the White House and Arlington National Cemetery to plan the events for a funeral service on Monday. It was agreed with the First Lady that the funeral procession would be led by the Marine Band. 1 million people lined the procession route from the Capitol back to the White House, and eventually to St. Matthew's Roman Catholic Cathedral, where the funeral would take place. The riderless horse would once again be led to the cathedral. The procession was led by the First Lady and the President's brothers, Robert and Ted. The two children would ride in a limo just behind. The new President, Lyndon Johnson, who was just sworn in, along with his wife, Lady Bird, also marched in the procession. Although President Johnson was pressured to not walk in the procession due to security risks, he chose to do so anyway. He called the decision one of the most difficult that he would make. On the next day, when he would make his way to the Oval Office, there was a letter from Mrs. Kennedy which simply began as "Thank you for walking yesterday." The funeral was invitation only and consisted of approximately 1,200 guests. The service itself would follow more of a traditional mass. He was presided over by Richard Cardinal Cushing, the Archbishop of Boston. He had close ties to the Kennedys. Although there was no eulogy given, excerpts from President Kennedy's speeches and statements were read. Mrs. Kennedy had requested Ave Maria to be performed just as it had been for her and the President's wedding. This would be one of the few times that she publicly lost her composure during all the happenings. After the service concluded, it was time to take the President to his resting place, Arlington National Cemetery. The final journey of this massive days-long ceremony would see the carriage take the President towards Arlington, and it was at this exact moment that one of the most iconic photos of all time was captured. Young John F. Kennedy Jr. saluting the casket of his father, and this would be where the children would say their final goodbyes, as they would not attend the burial ceremony. The procession would make its way across the Potomac River, and all of the dignitaries would follow. Mrs. Kennedy had requested the Irish Defense Forces perform a drill at the gravesite, marking the only time a foreign army has ever performed honors at a presidential grave. The burial service would conclude at 9:15 p.m., when Jacqueline Kennedy would light the eternal flame at his gravesite, and at 3:34, the casket would be lowered into the ground. The long and massive period of public mourning was over. The grave would later be moved just a few feet to its permanent resting place. It is said that over 16 million people visited the grave in the first 3 years after the death of President Kennedy. The flame still burns today.